I feel this evening we are overwhelmed with riches, that if Anne and her friends would stay, we could make place in the lecture. I feel very much at home, not only renewing friendships with Jim Wharton, but also with your dean and your director of continuing education. We were colleagues at Drew. And I have heard a great deal about Perkins, but I want to say that I don't know much specific about it. So that if I allude to theological education in some way in my two lectures and stumble across something that might be true about Perkins, that will be just stumbling and not malice aforethought. I do know enough that by comparison, your relationship with your university is an extremely graceful one. Sometimes at Drew, we exist in the embrace of our university in such a way that it is difficult to breathe. But it seems not to be the case here. This evening is a moment of conversation between us, although the setting does not imply that, but that's what's going to happen anyhow. And you know a professor is not completely comfortable in a setting without the equivalent of a chalkboard upon which he or she can place something illegible. So I hope you have those, have you? All right, these represent what I would put on the chalkboard if I had a chance, and they are meant to be a graph moving from page 1 to page 2, put together so that the seam goes at the year 70. And I choose to discuss what I think is the situation of our church and especially of our profession today by reviewing these decades, because my hermeneutical principle suggests that the circle requires us to touch the now as well as the past of the sacred text. And it doesn't matter much which order you take, but this evening I'm going to take the now. And that's a good way to begin a conversation, I think, because I'm not especially expert in now. I think of theological education as a conversation in which clergy and theological professors can share their expertise. And I would be happy to grant that you have the expertise in this century. And I would claim some expertise for the first century. So if we can put our expertises together, we may come out with a useful conversation. So take this survey, this walking through, and now that it's 25 to 9, let's run through these decades, because I hear of a gathering at 9 o'clock that is waiting for us, correct? They say, never mind, and I read something else out there. But let's see how it goes. I start with the 50s, because of course I lived in the 50s, and my ministry began there. But what for me is most important about the 50s, in most of the churches to which you're assigned, they will still be living in the person of often their ruling, pace-setting, dominating seniors in the 50s. And we will be being measured as pastor leaders by whether or not we are able to repeat the feats of good old Dr. What's-his-name, who was the pastoral leader in that golden age of Protestantism's memory, so far as we are able to remember directly. Not only do we meet his memory as people recount what he did, but often he is graphically present. Many congregations, parishes, churches have a rogues gallery if they're a prestigious enough church. in which the pastoral leaders are displayed. And usually for dear old Dr. What's-his-name, there is a special place. In my experience, it is often in the woman's lounge. That place which is reserved for holy activities, so that one must not go in there and do anything that might lead to the impression that human beings have used this place. And in that parlor, there is often a place of honor, which is either occupied by a picture of Holman's head of Christ or dear old Dr. What's-his-name. Now, as I walk through these, or run through these decades, please do not misunderstand my levity to be in any way condescending. The whole story, I think, of these decades is, from the point of view of the profession, somewhat of a tragedy. But my philosophy of life is, if you meet a tragedy, then you have a choice to laugh or cry. So I will choose to laugh. And in our family, the tradition is, if there is a disaster, it is called a learning experience. So let's say that these 4 decades, and we're almost in the middle of the 5th, have been a learning experience, but painful often along the way. How will we decide about our identity in the 1950s was the question. And what had led us to a conclusion was that the 50s were characterized by a time in which the church was, for the first time in a long time, that is the Protestant church, an operation of scale. From the turn of the century through the Depression and then through the New Deal, the Protestant church just stumbled along. And there was not enough going on in a church to bear much administration in that time. So a pastor's role was relatively simple. One would preach on Sunday, and probably Sunday night, and then one would visit the ill, but mainly what one could do at one's leisure was to wander through the community and eat one's way through the parish. And then on Sunday morning, having had a direct feel of what was going on in the community and in the parish, speak to it. But then the 50s came, and our congregations burgeoned. The key in those days to congregational development was simple. It was demographic survey. If there were a group of people that would represent some density of population, then the denominational executives planned to build a church there, in the confidence that if there were enough people, and they gave the opportunity of a building, then the people would come. Now, what was behind that was the marvelous experience for the nation of a really good war. World War II is the last good war we've had, and it was wonderful for the church, in that it was a holy war. That is, it was so clear that the opponents were satanic and we were the good guys, that it was easy to believe that God was on our side and that he fought with us and for us. And we all remember the slogans that characterized that time: God is my co-pilot, and there are no atheists in foxholes. And during that holy war, the church set its business aside with the understanding that after the war effort was over, then it could turn to its agenda. And when in the 50s we did that, we found a whole population that was grateful to God for the victory we might have lost. And they were prepared as a nation to come to church and to give some token of their gratitude. Now, I'm convinced that that was really what was going on in the crush to fill the churches in the 50s, although our present members of our congregation who were formed in the 50s will trace it to the efforts of good old Dr. What's-his-name. But I think I know somewhat different. I began my ministry in the 50s under the tutelage of Sam Shoemaker, and we were doing evangelism. And in those days, people were ready to make a commitment to Jesus Christ. And I remember visiting campuses that we would sometimes be on a campus for only a matter of hours, and to complete strangers, we would offer this opportunity, and they would kneel and dedicate themselves to Jesus Christ. That is, our effective leaders who model leadership for our time, for many of our people, were not really the driving force behind those burgeoning years. But as I sometimes put it to myself, if the population was there, and if you had an attractive sanctuary, if you could just get out of the way, people would come. Now, that is not to put down the sincerity or the preaching skill or the pastoral visiting skills of dear old Dr. What's-his-name, because in those days people were still calling. And I think they were pulpiteers in ways that people say we are not, because they were so encouraged by the crowds which are present. You know, half of preaching is the half of listening. But whatever the case, we ought not to fall into the error of supposing that the people with whom we are being compared were so terribly talented, so much more effective than we might have been if we had lived in that time. But at that time, we began to form pastoral identity according to scale. And if you will notice on your sheet, the great resource in those times was H. Richard Niebuhr's The Purpose of the Church and Its Ministry. And in order then to prescribe something that would fit now a burgeoning institution, he called for pastoral director. And that became then the definition of the pastoral leader of the time. And what that translated to, once we began to tap into the resources that would equip a pastoral leader to administer an impressive institution, we tapped into the business community. And as a result, then, what happened was people perceived the pastoral leader as the equivalent in the church of a CEO. And people thinking of that model still are looking for people who will be CEOs. And dear old Dr. What's-his-name ran that operation pretty much like a CEO. So the administrative boards had agendas, probably, but they were not for discussion. They were for ratification. And things moved rather swiftly. And since then, if you are not powerful enough to manage such kind of administration, then people who remember that as the definitive time wonder if you are equipped to be a minister. In fact, in the Methodist Church, that then became the definition of the major qualification for superintendency. So when you elect bishops, or used to, the conversation was, of course, the person is a man of God, and they were all men. Of course, this is a man of God, but what we want to really know, what kind of administrator is he? Pastoral director. And then by reflection, the congregation was a club that followed the lead of this director. And we now have a term for that club, that is, they were following what we call civil religion. Will Herberg wrote in the 50s, not to be Catholic, Protestant, or Jew is somehow not to be an American. So it was a club guided by males understanding that there was no gap at all between faithfulness to the nation and faithfulness to Jesus Christ. And it was that time that they planted the flag in the sanctuary, never to be moved without great trauma. But then one cannot smother the gospel that long. So the 60s came, and the nation, which had been quite content with itself, came under prophetic review. And under prophetic review, we did not pass muster. And quickly, the model for the pastoral leader shifted to the prophet. My understanding of prophet from the seminary I attended was a person with courage enough to preach a congregation empty. And the person who was, they were men of course, were held up as models to us were people who had had congregations and had brought social justice so much to their attention that the congregation had dispersed and the pastor had been promoted to boards or agencies of the denomination. We were still then, I think, though, borrowing identity, because prophet took on a different connotation from the one which is given to it in redemptive history from a biblical point of view. And prophet really meant community organizer. Now, that is not to say that many pastors got away with this, but this is what the boards and agencies and the seminaries of my time were recommending. And ever since then, we have been graduating people who knew that they were supposed to be prophets and execute social justice in some way through their congregations and their community. But they have no idea how in the world to do that. So when we surveyed graduates of Drew, what we found was a low grade of guilt because they were not prophets, but that they knew that they were supposed to be. In my day, the handbook for the prophet was by Saul Alinsky, Reveille for Radicals. Anybody familiar with that text at all? Do you know the Urban Institute in Chicago, which is training people? Is that a more familiar term? But we were trying, by exercise of power and manipulation of opponents in communities, to increase the level of social justice. And theologically, we were following again H. Richard Niebuhr, and we were choosing his option, Christ the transformer of culture. So what we were being taught in seminary was, you are out there to transform. And unless you transform, in some way you have failed. So ideally, then the congregation became a caucus which gathered around the issue which the prophet chose. And very often, you remember in those days, the issue was chosen by watching the television news. And we chose the prophetic issue by the one that had the story with legs. Although, as I say, this was being held up as a model, but was not living and acting in most congregations. The best most of us could do was, although we in our spare time participated in the demonstrations, our congregations hoped to goodness that we would not show up in the camera on the news that evening. And if we did, we had to pay. The 60s became a crucial, troubled time for the church. What tore it for the Presbyterian Church was Angela Davis. Does anybody remember Angela? We were living in Marin County at that time because we were teaching in the Presbyterian Seminary located there. And Angela Davis was on trial in connection with an episode which had happened in a courtroom which had led to people dying. And Angela was the model to blow the mind of a middle-class Protestant. Of course, she was a woman, and then she was black. And worst of all, she was communist Marxist. So when the Division of Race and Society contributed $10,000 to her defense, the Presbyterian Church went up in flames. And each denomination had, I think, some comparable episode. I do not know Methodist history that well, but I do know that you tracked your Board of Global Ministry very carefully. Until finally its director became a member of the faculty at Drew. We got our people a little quicker than you did. What we did was we had two strategies, which still hang over us, I think. They were the collection plate boycott. That is, if you didn't pay these clowns, then there wouldn't be any slot for them. And at that point, we devised designated giving, so that you could put on your envelope some kind of assurance that this monies would not go to the people who were leading these kinds of justice interests. And then the second device, which we gathered was effective, and Presbyterians and our lay people in general are not dumb. That is, if you give them a political task to execute, they'll do it. And the second device they clamped on was reorganization. We've been reorganizing the Presbyterian Church ever since. We just are undergoing our, I don't know, maybe the 5th reorganization this year. And the beauty of reorganization is that no one is fired or accused of any malfeasance. But what happens is, in reorganization, you just redraw the chart, and it turns out that in the new organizational chart, the people that you've been troubled by just don't appear. And then it is carefully explained to them, no malice, no fault on their part, it's just the way the organization came out. So in the 70s, then, we shifted to try and be more amenable to our congregations, less confrontational and less disturbing. Now, let me just for a moment jump down to the culture slot in your sheets, which is the bottom third. And much was going on there, but for me, the bellwether of how we are doing in America with justice has to do with how we treat our black population. And you'll notice I've traced that movement with a little detail. It began back in the Holy War, unintended on our part. It turned out that blacks showed that they were equal to the rest of the population, because during the war we gave them assignments and made them perform twice or 3 times as effectively as white units, and under God they did. So they came out of that war realizing that they were better than this society had declared them to be, and they were ready to agitate for their correct and rightful place. And Truman, of all people, began the thing rolling with the integration of the armed forces. For me, it's an irony that so many other institutions in our culture step forward for racial justice before the church makes its move. And then in '54, you'll notice, there was the great move by the Supreme Court. The ways of God are wondrous to behold and unpredictable. And in '54, in Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, separate but equal was declared to be unjust and unconstitutional, and Plessy versus Ferguson of 1896 was turned over, and the march was on. In the 50s, the civil rights movement began to move with King, chosen by the boycott in Montgomery, and at the head of SCLC, until it peaked, in my estimation, at the March on Washington in 1963. My deep engagement was at that time was with the seminary where I was serving. The call went out for Selma in '65, you remember, some of you. Anybody who can, come. So Drew sent 2 young professors, and we sized up the situation and came back and said, we ought to go. And they closed the seminary down and put as many on the bus as they could get, and they went and serviced the march out of Selma. We were being led by Martin Luther King, whose strategy was nonviolent and clearly founded in the church. But the next year, James Meredith was killed, and the young leaders in the black movement found that they could not be as patient as nonviolence required. So Black Power made its move in 1966, and in 1967, Carmichael and Hamilton wrote the text, Black Power, which then began to dominate the movement. And from the point of view of the church's participation, at that point, the church's participation became peripheral. And I would say, as movement of the people, the civil rights movement collapsed. Not that strategies and progress were not still made, but it was not something we were behind together. And then the Vietnam War upstaged the civil rights movement, and that's where the young people went. And I have a crooked line drawn down through the latter part of the 60s, and that's where I think the fault begins to open up, like the St. Andreas's fault in California. And the age which the 50s celebrated began to end there, and in the course of the 70s did come to its end. Those forces in the society which were pressing for justice in their own way and were modeling the age to come were not church people, but they were coming from an ideology which now, looking back, we recognize as an Enlightenment movement. You remember, American history has always been a contest between the Puritans and the Founding Fathers. And it looked like until about the end of the 60s and somewhere in the middle of the 70s, the Puritans, the Protestants, were in control. But somewhere in there we lost it. Then we came out of seminary with a different model for the parish ministry. We had worn out transformation of congregations from the point of view of justice, but we were still determined to be transformers. One cannot be a minister with dignity unless one is transforming someone. So we found a more gentle way to do transformation. And if in the 50s we turned to the business community for a borrowed identity, and in the 60s to community organization for a borrowed identity, I think in the 70s we turned to the therapeutic community for borrowed identity. It was a great advantage because now you could offer your congregation transformation without confronting or contradicting them. Because by this time our congregations were terribly conflicted. You will notice that we split at that point into the public and private parties, as I call them, with an attempt to be as neutral as possible. And commentators on that age say at that point we lost the middle. That there used to be in our congregations an overwhelming number of people who were interested in personal salvation in Jesus Christ, and were also interested in justice, and didn't see that they were in competition. But then through the 60s and into the early 70s, they weren't getting much nurture because the people who were screaming for attention were getting it. And I would think partly by neglect we let the middle go. And incidentally, at that time we stopped calling. I'm not sure when the date was or exactly why, but it has some correlation with the medical profession stopping calling. I know why the medical profession stopped calling. They stopped calling because they worked it out in terms of a time motion study and knew that they couldn't make as much money as they needed to if they couldn't bill people on the road. So that settled that. If you were sick, you had to find the physician. He would not find you. We were becoming professional enough that although we were not driven as clearly by monetary and career ends, we did find ourselves rather busy with this thing of scale and also with the model of the enabled therapist and an enabler, if he is modeling himself on a therapist. And now we were beginning to have women. It is beneath your professional dignity to hunt for clients. You're just supposed to be able to hang out a shingle, and then they see the shingle and they call for an appointment. So in the 70s, we were graduating a group of people who were sent to the equivalent of the end of the earth. For us in New Jersey, that's the Delaware Water Gap. Now, where would that be in Texas? The Mexican border? South, west? West, all right. East. We had people sent to the Delaware Water Gap among a rural population who had never heard about enablers, let alone therapists. And we had pastors who opened their offices by finding a place for their appointment book. And then they sat by the phone waiting for the congregation to call for appointments. Sometimes they sat for months before they realized this wasn't fitting. At that point, clinical pastoral education tended to, I think, upstage the rest of theological education. That is, that's where you learned to be an enabler. And then, I think this is one of the reasons we did not do the calling we used to do. Then our specialty was people in extremis, because CPE tends to happen in a hospital setting. So then we concentrated on the people who were in the hospitals. And between administration and some attention to social justice and following the people who were in need, then we really didn't have time left now to wander through the community and speak to people and visit in the local diner. Henry Nouwen, I think, was the great text of the time. An enabler took on this pathos of being a wounded healer. Now, what happened in this period with the congregation? I think they took on the expectations that belong to having a professional guiding them at some distance. They thought of themselves as basically a waiting room. And the doctor was sometimes in and often out. Then what was the point of staying? I think it was a form of insurance, that sooner or later your trauma would come. And when it did, you would deserve the enabler's attention. And he or she would come with great skill and help you through this traumatic time. And I must say, by way of appreciation, we became very skillful at that point in handling such situations when we were worried about them before. And incidentally, the rest of the caring professions, which we were aping at the time, were so happy to have someone who would not run away when people were in extremis, and especially when people were on the verge of dying. Then the physicians, whom we often envied, ran the other way, and we were left carrying the ball. And our congregations, in the measure that they were experiencing this trauma, were terribly grateful. But meanwhile, the congregation was belonging primarily to the society, and the society was far from now coming automatically to the church. I'm going to risk going to about 9:15. We can get away with that? Can I get away with that? All right. We were following the model of the caring professional. But our society, and by that we were neglecting, I would say, the people who are normal. You really had to show some kind of neurosis or extremis to get attention in that time. So our normals and healthy got neglected and went elsewhere in the society for the satisfaction of their needs. If I look in redemptive history for the time which characterizes the late 60s and the early 70s, then I would turn to Exodus 32. Where you remember Moses has gone up to the mountain to get the 10 Commandments. But he's gone longer than the people expect. To get CPE training takes a while. One might even register for a Doctor of Ministry program. And the congregation is a little uneasy. You'll be gone for longer than they intended. But of course, the happy part of that is you will be a doctor like dear old Dr. What's-his-name was. Please understand, I've been engaged in the Doctor of Ministry program from its beginning. San Francisco Theological Seminary was one of the pioneers, and I helped to design their program, so what I'm doing is ironic. So they went elsewhere, the way the people of Israel did, for their satisfaction. When the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people gathered around Aaron and said to him, "Come, make gods for us who shall go before us, as for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt. We do not know what has become of him." And then the barbecue was invented in redemptive history. They rose early the next day and offered burnt offerings and brought sacrifices of well-being. Can't you see the beer advertisement? And the people sat down to eat and drink. And if I may be permitted a slight modification of the translation, and rose up again to score. Now that could be translated to sports, but I know I'm in Dallas and I'm not going to play with that tonight. But the truth is, then, the people who had belonged to us went elsewhere and explored almost everything else but what Protestants had suggested was the way of life, in hopes that it would bring the dream which the founding fathers had promised. And someone brought to me what I think was an adequate symbol of that time, a gift by people coming to dinner. And what they brought me was barbecue sauce. And the title of that sauce, the name of that sauce, the logo of that sauce is Religious Experience. Have any of you ever had it? It's made in Colorado. I can give you the address. But this is what our people, I think, were doing. They have on the label of this sauce its origins. They call it the RE, story. Story, as in gospel, comes in story. Here is the story. Perhaps it was something I ate. The first thing I remember was wandering aimlessly in the Sonoran desert, dressed only in a cheap border town serape and a pair of wingtip shoes. I love it. Pinned to the serape was a hot sauce recipe and a note that read simply, "Spread the sauce." Seemed pretty clear to me, so that's what I've been doing. Hope you love it. Signed, J.K. McFadden, Sauce Spreader. And I would suggest to you that the story of our culture primarily since the middle of the 60s and the middle of the 70s has been not spreading the gospel, but spreading the sauce. And through the rejection of our personal ethics of responsibility, either with respect to sexuality or work, by rejection of the meaning which we say life has under the gospel, by the use of drugs, by entertaining ourselves to death, and in the process by losing the community for which we used to stand, every person then on their own began to try and find the barbecue that would fit them. So that when we come to the decade of the 80s, all hell has broken loose. And what pastoral leaders are supposed to do in that time is very difficult to say. So the best I could come up with was, at that point, we had no clearly defined role, except we carried all of the older roles with us. That is, when we picked up a new one, we never discarded an old one. So we continued to be administrators, pastoral directors. We continued to attempt to be prophets. We continued to attempt to be enablers, but now our people were coming primarily as private individuals for the solution to their quest for meaning, their private search, which they had lost in all of the other institutions of society, and they were hoping that we would provide that to them without encumbering them by community. So at that point, I think we became, this is the closest I can come, but by way of conversation, help me. I hope that in the time we gather together and you can talk back, that you will help me repair, correct, whatever this outline, according to your experience. I think at that point we became traffic controllers. That is, everyone was on their own flight, and they didn't want to meet one another. So our job was to try and track them with radar so that they would not collide, and keep the congregation going and avoiding collision, knowing that occasionally they would need to land for birth, for confirmation, for baptism, for illness, for death. And then the idea was to try and bring them into the runway and service them according to their needs and let them get out again without having contact with anybody else. And so the congregation understood themselves in a holding pattern. With that as a background, now we are trying to figure out, we do know, I think now, that something did happen in the 60s and 70s, which at the time we did not realize. But looking back now, I think we are beginning to get it. With George, we just didn't get it for a long time. But now I think we are getting it. And people who are helping us are people like Newbigin, who are letting us know that Christendom has come to an end, that there is a change of paradigm. And we must go at it in a new way, quite different from all of the expectations which were built in the time of the 50s, which many of our parishioners are still looking back upon as the golden time. It is being suggested that we be spiritual directors, that we be missionaries. But I think where we are right now, which I would like to address when I come to Paul at our next lecture, is that we are market analysts, and our congregation is primarily made up of comparative consumers. And what is asked for is that we give them programs which will satisfy their felt needs. And often those felt needs are very much like continuing to spread the sauce. Now, I do not think, having learned from the 60s, that we need to find fault, to be censorious, to be confrontational with our members or our prospective members, given what the culture has done to them and what we have not. But instead, we must find a way to meet them the way Paul did, a Jew to the Jews, a Greek to the Greeks, so that by the grace of the gospel, he might be able to win some. And in closing, let me suggest how it is somehow that we need to meet this need. Not by being censorious, but by being attractive. More attractive than the barbecue that's going on. And a great model for this in closing is the one in one of the stories of Maya Angelou. Wouldn't take nothing for my ways a woman. Wouldn't take nothing for my journey now. That's it. Okay? Familiar with that book? It begins with the story of this little episode of Aunt T, who is now in her 80s, and she's looking back on her time of service, a black lady. I used to visit her often and perch on her uncomfortable sofa just to hear her stories. She was proud that after working 30 years as a maid, she spent the next 30 years as a live-in housekeeper, carrying the keys to rich houses and keeping meticulous accounts. Quote, living in lets the white folks know Negroes are as neat and clean as they are, sometimes more so, and it gives the Negro maid a chance to see white folks ain't no smarter than Negroes, just luckier sometimes. Aunt T told me that once she was housekeeper for a couple in Bel Air, California. I would say that's a very good site for the barbecue. Lived with them in a 14-room ranch house. There was a day maid who cleaned and a gardener who daily tended the lush gardens. Aunt T oversaw the workers. When she had begun the job, she had cooked and served a light breakfast, a good lunch, and a full 3- or 4-course dinner to her employers and their guests. Aunt T said she watched them grow older and leaner. I'm thinking of congregations. After a few years, they stopped entertaining and ate dinner, hardly seeing each other at the table. Finally, they sat in dry silence as they ate evening meals of soft scrambled eggs, Melba toast, and weak tea. Aunt T said she saw them growing old, but didn't see herself aging at all. She became the social maven. She started keeping company, her phrase, with a chauffeur down the street. Her best friend and her friend's husband worked in service only a few blocks away. On Saturdays, Aunt T would cook a pot of pig's feet, a pot of greens, fry chicken, make potato salad, and bake a banana pudding. Then that evening, her friends, the chauffeur, the other housekeeper, and her husband would come to Aunt T's commodious live-in quarters, and there the four would eat and drink, play records and dance, and as the evening wore on, they would settle down to a serious game of bid-whist. Naturally, during this revelry, jokes were told, fingers snapped, feet were patted, and there was a great deal of laughter. Aunt T said that what occurred during every Saturday party startled her. What occurred during every Saturday party startled her and her friends the first time it happened. They had been playing cards, and Aunt T, who had just won the bid, held a handful of trumps when she felt a cold breeze on her back and sat upright and turned around. Her employers had cracked her door open and beckoned to her. Aunt T, a little peeved, laid down her cards and went to the door. The couple backed away and asked her to come into the hall, and there they both spoke and won Aunt T's sympathy forever. Quote, "Teresa, we do not mean to disturb you," the man whispered, "but you all seem to be having such a good time." The woman added, "We hear you and your friends laughing every Saturday night and would just like to watch you. We don't want to bother you. We'll be quiet and just watch." The man said, "If you'll just leave your door ajar, your friends don't need to know. We'll never make a sound." And Aunt T said she saw no harm in agreeing, and she talked it over with her company, and they said it was okay with them. But it was sad that the employers owned the gracious house, the swimming pool, 3 cars, and numberless palm trees, but had no joy. It's time for our gatherings to exhibit the joy that the people at the barbecue are not having. Leave the door ajar so that they may catch the drift of our joy in Christ and want to come and join us.